Welcome to another episode of the brand called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very talented professional from Seattle, USA, Mr. Dario Cvencek. Dario, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Dario is an immigrant and a refugee poet from the Balkans. He's an author of a book titled PTSD Martini. So, Dario, my first question to you, growing up during the Bosnian War must have deeply shaped your worldview. How did those early experiences influence your sense of identity and belonging?
That's a great question. Experiencing war at an early age definitely shaped my worldview in many different ways. And the most powerful way being that I became acutely aware that, belonging is a very relative term.
Mm.
It's something that changes. For example, between ages 13 and 21, my family moved a lot. I went to 6 or 7 different schools. We lived in several different countries, and you learn very, very, very quickly that you basically belong to people and not to places. And it's kind of an ongoing challenge for me, something that I'm still struggling with because I'm from one country, but I live in another. And here in America, I'm a foreigner, but back home, I'm an American. So it's kind of like always
Mm.
trying to reconcile
Yeah.
those two identities. But fortunately, my friends and my family, they don't rely on those labels. And to them, I'm just Dario. I'm just who I am.
Mm.
And I think that's what it is in a nutshell. Other people seeing you the way you see yourself.
Mm.
To me, that's what belonging is.
Mm. What a great response. Thank you. And how did your journey from Bosnia to Germany and eventually to the United States change your understanding of home?
Yeah, so that's a great follow-up because it is kind of like what is home, what is identity,
Yeah.
what is belonging. And I think uh, you know, home is where you are. But if you move around a lot, wherever you are at any given point in time, that's what your home is. And there was a long stretch of time after the war that I did not visit back home. And after I finally did, I realized that it wasn't quite the same place in which I grew up.
Hmm.
But in a way, there still were a lot of things that were the same.
Hmm.
Sounds, smells, foods, music, the nuances of specific dialects, which for me as a writer, that's obviously very important to me.
Yeah.
And then, seeing like my cousins there, uh, reconnecting with friends who live in different parts from elementary school, who live in different parts of the world. That's kind of a constant.
Hmm.
And it somehow all fits under this umbrella of home. And that umbrella also includes Seattle, where I
Yeah.
live now,
Yeah. Yeah.
because it rains so much in Seattle.
Absolutely.
And
Abs-
yeah,
Absolutely. And I can appreciate what you're saying. I mean, you went through lots of trauma because of the war, but I remember moving from one place to the other because my father was an army officer. So we moved all over the country. And I
yeah,
can appreciate what you're saying. But moving on, Dario, as an immigrant poet, what challenges did you face in finding your voice in a new language and a new culture?
yeah. That's a good question. It's a challenge in as much as any process of self-discovery
Hmm.
is a challenge. The
Hmm.
new culture and new language are not some random variables that exert an influence on my writing. It's rather a conscious choice and conscious decisions that me and my family made because
Hmm.
we chose to live in a certain place.
Yeah.
We wanted to live in a certain kind of country, and we picked United States for a reason.
Hmm.
But United States in 1990s, when we
Hmm.
moved here, was a very different country than
Yeah.
it is nowadays.
Hmm.
So, in the beginning, for me, when it came to writing, it was really hard to
Hmm.
write in English because I had to learn English, and oftentimes I did not have the words to express
Yeah.
when I wanted to. But then, once I kind of gained more command of the language, it felt liberating. It felt freeing
Hmm.
because I was no longer bound. Everything I knew about poetry was in my native language.
Hmm.
And Also in Germany, actually, because we studied a lot of German classics there.
Mm,
And that's there's a lot of meter and a lot of rhyme and a lot of rules. And then when I started writing in English, I was no longer bound by those. I could do whatever I want.
mm.
I could even curse in my poems. And that was it's kind of like running a different operating system in your head.
Mm,
And there are always advantages and disadvantages of writing in one versus the other language. And I'm trying to navigate both in my
mm,
writing. And
mm,
sometimes, actually, when I get stuck in English, when I hit a writer's block,
mm,
I try to write in my language and then
mm.
translate it into
Yeah.
English. And more often than not, that little trick, does the job of getting over a writer's block.
Mm. Fascinating. Do you see yourself primarily as a Balkan poet, an immigrant poet, or simply as a poet of the human condition?
I think all of those, all of the above. Initially, I think the way I saw myself was the way I presented myself was as a Balkan poet because a lot of people write. I wanted to distinguish myself. I
Yeah.
wanted to have like a unique voice, not just write about the same thing that everybody else is writing about. But I realized very quickly that Balkan is a very niche way of defining yourself,
Mm,
and also a very complex way because as a region, Balkan has a very complex history, and sometimes it's so complex where it becomes difficult for people to understand.
correct.
And being an immigrant is a much broader category. And it's something that resonates with millions of people around the globe. So, in a sense, it's a more universal, archetypal, if you will, way of story that can be told.
Mm,
And focusing on that aspect is something that forces me to understand other immigrant experiences,
mm.
especially with everything that's going on in America
Yeah.
today, to notice these finer shades of different immigrant experiences and
Yeah.
extract common denominator.
Mm,
Because immigrants are immigrants and they share something regardless of their upbringing,
correct.
regardless of their cultural background.
Yeah.
Uh, in a way, being an immigrant is a very unique way of being human. So
Mm,
that's where we come back to human condition,
mm.
because it is an aspect, or it's
Yeah.
just one way of being human.
Yeah.
And it has its advantages and also its challenges. And I think that's a very important realization in my work moving forward, especially in light of growing anti-immigrant sentiments that we're seeing across many Western
Correct.
democracies.
Correct. Well said. And what inspired you to title your first full-length poetry collection PTSD Martini?
Okay, so just to share with your readers, so the collection, so it looks like this. So
Yeah.
there's a martini glass,
Another
and then
martini
instead of
glass.
two olives, he has two hand grenades.
Yeah.
And that's kind of this image that came to me, two hand grenades in a martini glass. And it was just a quick sort of snapshot of a black outline against a blue background, kind of
Mm,
black and blue,
mm.
indicating bruising,
Yeah.
indicating being
Yeah.
hurt.
Mm.
That's the PTSD part, the
Yeah.
trauma. And the martini part was meant to be evocative of the idea that one can get addicted to trauma, just like one
Mm.
can get
Okay.
addicted on alcohol.
Mm.
And the basic idea can be then further extrapolated to the concept of being hungover. I kind of wanted to evoke that because, hungover on trauma, you kind of reach a point where you've had enough. You reach a point where you need to confront it and you're not going around it anymore. And this hangover needs to be cured. And you
Mm.
need to face it head on, directly, and take responsibility for your trauma and process it. And PTSD Martini was my own way of doing that.
Mm. You use the phrase addicted to trauma. That's the first time I've heard something like this. Help me understand this a little more.
I think oftentimes people like to see themselves as victims and they need to and it's also a defense mechanism. I think if you rehearse the same
Yeah.
story over and
Yeah.
over again, maybe you
Yeah.
can make some sense of it.
Mm.
But the issue is not to make sense of the issue, is to overcome it. And in writing, I'm also in a way I'm trying to make sense of it, but I'm
Mm.
also trying to get it out of my system.
Very interesting. Dario, how do war and displacement continue to echo in your poetry, even so many years after you left the Balkans?
Well, that's I never really planned to write that much about war.
Mm.
And the amount of mental space that the war continues to occupy in my mind
Mm.
to this day is not something that I would have predicted.
Mm.
And I think it's because, unfortunately, there are constant reminders of what war looks like. It's
Mm.
on our TV screens, computer screens,
Yeah.
phone screens, the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, new war hotspots opening up in other parts of the world.
Mm.
And as much as I would like to forget these images and sounds of the war, I keep getting reminded of what it feels and sounds like
Mm.
on a daily basis. And
Mm.
these memories, uh, they're kind of like stored somewhere deep inside, like in my bones and in my muscles.
Yeah.
And I just keep rehearsing them. That's kind of what we talked about earlier. This, being addicted on trauma. You just want, in fact, the war in Ukraine, that actually was the linchpin for me writing about war. Because
Mm.
when that started, I found myself glued to TV and just watching uh, news footage from Ukraine
Yeah.
for like a week. I just couldn't, I don't know, I was like obsessed with it and I
Mm.
didn't really understand why. I don't have any connection to Ukraine. Um, and after a while, I realized that because Ukraine is another Slavic country,
Yeah.
those places, those buildings, those faces, they
Mm.
look like places back home.
Mm.
And for me, it was almost like watching the war back home in real time. And that kind of prompted me to start writing about it and drawing parallels between war in Bosnia and the war in Ukraine. And then I've done that also with Gaza. So in a way, that continues to be a theme. In a way, also because I feel, given my experiences, I do have authority to talk about it.
Mm.
I cannot write about things that I haven't experienced. And
Mm.
unfortunately, I did experience a war. So that's one of the things that I read about.
Mm. Wow.
Yeah.
In your work, trauma and tenderness often coexist. How do you find this balance when you write?
That's a great observation. I'm gonna use that like when I submit descriptions of my writing.
Hmm.
In a way, trauma is an unhealed wound,
Mm.
and a wound that hasn't healed properly continues to be tender.
Mm.
Someone touches it and it hurts.
Yeah.
And the hurting part is needed because there needs to be enough vulnerability on the
Mm.
page to
Mm.
invite the reader into my world,
Mm.
to let them know that it's safe there.
Mm.
Because if I can be tender about my pain, then maybe they can also be tender with themselves. And that they can allow him or herself to be vulnerable too. And I hope that's kind of something that happens as people process what they read in my poetry.
Mm. Very interesting. Many of your poems weave together war memories and Slavic folklore. What draws you to this blend of myth and memory?
Interesting. Myth and memory. Huh. I think I think all memory is a myth, more or
Okay.
less. You
Okay.
know, even our own personal memories that are
Mm.
filtered through the lenses of our experience and kind of like sifted through these
Mm.
different seeds of our
Yeah.
personalities and temperament and so on. So, what I'm in part trying to do with my poetry is to both connect and also juxtapose personal mythology with cultural
Mm.
mythology,
Mm.
to re-examine and reevaluate each one of them.
Mm.
As an example, a great Canadian poet and singer, Leonard Cohen, has an early collection of poetry entitled Let Us Compare Mythologies.
Mhm.
Comparing and contrasting.
Mm.
To me, that's an important part of the artistic process.
Mm.
And I believe that every art
Yeah.
should question,
Mm.
and at least to some degree,
Mm.
and then also reconstruct, because that's what creating and recreating is. And mythology and myths, they all have expiration dates, and new ideas and new concepts need to be rebuilt from these materials and this collective consciousness that we have and share.
Mm. Amazing. Moving on, how do you navigate writing about pain without letting it consume the tone or direction of the work you're doing?
Well, for me, writing itself is an act of navigating that really
Right.
fine line. Writing is an act of bringing something to the surface,
Mm.
making it conscious, and then examining it from multiple angles
Yeah.
and presenting it to the reader, to the outside world.
Mm.
Not necessarily fully dissecting it for the reader, but rather just describing it well enough so the reader can begin constructing a template for his or her own healing journey.
Mm.
And for me personally, the creative process itself is a healing journey. It forces me to process my own emotions, my own pain more deeply.
Mm.
And in doing so, I kind of just get it out of my system. Once it's on the page, it's no longer inside of me.
Yeah.
And if I can do that for at least some of my readers, then that would be like the full circle. And
Mm.
I see that happening when I perform at open mics sometimes. And I do hope it happens when people read it by themselves as well.
Mm. Amazing. Your work often touches on identity and belonging. How do you define identity in your poetry?
Well, so poetry is something I do on the side. So
Mm.
for my job, I am a research scientist at the University of Washington, and I study how children learn. I'm a
Mm.
developmental psychologist, and in my scientific work, and especially on my work on what we call implicit social cognition,
Mhm.
which is beliefs and attitudes that operate below conscious awareness, we define identity as a cognitive kind of association, kind of like a link,
Mm.
a memory structure, if you will, that connects the concept of self, that is me, with other concepts and categories.
Mm.
And I have not really thought about it this much in terms of poetry, but I think the same principle applies. My identity is who I am,
Yeah.
and who I am, and who you are, and who everybody is. There's a lot of different ways of being, human. And
Mm.
some of those ways are quite mundane. So, for example, we are all grocery store shoppers at
Mm.
some level, right?
Yeah.
That's not very unique. But then some ways of being are very unique and
Mm.
intriguing and interesting. And I think the task of a writer is to strike the correct balance between something being interesting enough
Yeah.
so others want to read about it, but also relatable enough so it actually makes sense and they
Mm.
can reinterpret it in their own way.
Very interesting.
Because I study human behavior,
Mm.
I think human beings are fascinating and how we as individuals behave when we are on our own versus in a group.
Yeah.
Uh, that's always been of interest to me. And from a scientific point, for sure, but also from an artistic angle, because who we are changes with time and
Mm.
circumstances.
Mm.
And our identity is always in flux. But that's also like how life is. Life is always
Yeah.
change and
Yeah.
flux. Yeah.
Very interesting. How has your writing in English shaped your relationship with your mother tongue and your cultural and your sense of cultural identity?
Hmm. Well, if we go back, when I first started writing, it was only in my native language.
Yeah.
And when we moved to the United States and I started college, I began writing in English. And then there was this one like 3 or 4 year stint where I
Mm.
wrote exclusively just in English.
Mm.
And like I said earlier, that was very liberating. I could play with different forms and like experiment and so on. And then I stopped writing altogether. And I just focused on my scientific career. And then what I do as part of my job is also scientific writing.
Mm.
And scientific writing is also a form of writing.
Yeah.
And that writing I do exclusively in English. So I've never written a paper in my language.
Mm.
I always write scientific papers in English. So over the years, English kind of became my primary mode of
Yeah.
expression.
Mm.
And then a few years back, kind of like coinciding with the COVID pandemic, I started writing poetry much more regularly. And then I went back to writing in my language.
Mm.
But then very quickly, I wanted to share those poems with others, and I couldn't because they were written in my mother tongue.
Right.
So I started translating my own poetry into English.
Right.
And then in that process, I discovered a very interesting phenomenon. If
Mm.
I, let's say I write a poem tonight, write
Mm.
it tonight in my native language, and then I wait until tomorrow to translate it. That translation would usually come out clunky. It just wouldn't feel right, right? But then if I finish writing in my language, and then I just start translating it right away while it's
Yeah.
still fresh in my mind. It comes out perfectly.
Wonderful.
And I'm not entirely sure how or why that works, but
Mm,
I'm glad that it does because to be able to switch between two languages like that
mm,
is a really good thing for a poet to be able to do.
mm.
And I think at this point, I write primarily in English because what I write about are nowadays are some uniquely American themes,
Yeah.
especially with respect to immigrant experience in America. And it's hard for me to write about American topics in a
Correct.
Slavic language.
Correct. Absolutely. A few minutes back, you were showing me the cover of your book, PTSD Martini, and you told me what the cover represents,
Yeah.
blue and black. But can you describe for me how the structure of PTSD Martini mirrors the emotional journey it represents?
Yeah, because I had to. That's the thing. Like you publish a book and you have to decide what
Yeah.
order you put your poems in, right? So I
Yeah.
try to organize poems in a certain order, so they evoke different moods as the reader progresses through the collection. And the poems at the beginning are very angry and dark, and then the tone lightens as you read more, but it never really becomes cheery. It
Right.
ends on a kind of a funny note,
Yeah.
but still a dark note and never crosses over into positive emotions. And that actually was intentional because I decided early on when I kind of was looking at, okay, I have all these poems, which one? I cannot publish all of them at once. What am I going to put in the first collection? I decided to separate dark poems from uplifting poems. And that uplifting leg of the journey will be in the second book, which actually will be coming out in early 2026, like either in
Mm.
January or
Yeah.
February. And the title of that collection is Mirror Made of Words.
Hmm.
And while PTSD Martini was about war, trauma, and healing,
Mm.
Mirror will be about growth, self-reflection, and self-discovery.
How interesting.
So to complete this like full journey, I guess the readers will have to buy the second book too.
Correct.
Yeah.
Which poem in the collection was the hardest for you to write and why?
Okay, that's easy. I have one poem called "Please Will You Come,"
Hmm.
and it's about Hind Rajab, the little girl who was killed in Gaza. And it was hard for me to write because at the time when it happened, not much information was available.
Mm.
So I had to research various newspapers and magazines across the globe. So like
Mm.
everything I could find in English, anything I could find in my language, anything I could find in German, to kind of cross-verify what the actual facts were.
Mm.
And a lot of my poems, especially the ones that have political themes, I approach them from almost journalistic perspective. And sometimes, as an artist, I want to comment. I want to give my own opinion on what
Mm.
happened. But sometimes I just want to document what took place,
Mm.
to be a witness. And one needs to be very careful with that because there's a lot of misinformation out there. I
Mm.
think there's a lot of falsehoods and people just write what's our opinions and our facts. So I had to read a lot. If I'm going to write a poem that's like that serious and that dark, I had to do a lot of research and reading. I had to read a lot of graphic reports
Mm.
of that particular shooting incident to establish for myself what the facts are.
Yeah.
And that was not easy. Uh, and reading all that, that's why kind of it's probably the darkest poem I have in the collection. But it was recently accepted by a magazine, Canadian online magazine called Shadow and Sax. So
Hmm.
it will be coming out on their website soon.
Amazing. Do you see poetry as a form of therapy, resistance, or both?
Wow. Your questions keep hitting the nail on the head, really. It's both. It's definitely both.
Mm.
As an individual act of me sitting at a keyboard and typing,
Mm.
it's primarily a form of therapy.
Mm.
That's what it does for me.
Yeah.
But once I post it online or I publish it or I perform it, it becomes a collective act that
Mm.
inevitably engages other people.
Amazing.
And I often write about the hypocrisy of modern political powers that be.
Yeah.
So this collective sharing very quickly translates into an act of resistance.
Mm.
And that's actually one of the guiding principles behind the open mic series that I host, Speak Out Seattle.
Yeah. Yeah. And my next question is about the open mic series. How does hosting Speak Out Seattle influence your view of poetry as a communal act?
So, just to bring your listeners up to speed, Speak Out Seattle is a curated poetry, music,
Mm.
comedy showcase that features edgy local talent around Greater Seattle area.
Right.
We have events once a month, and we focus on featuring artists from marginalized and underrepresented communities. And our goal is to provide a public platform for
Mm.
those voices and those stories to be heard.
Mm.
And for me, hosting Speak Out Seattle has been an unexpected blessing. When I first started the series with a friend of mine, the main motivation was entertainment. We just wanted to have a fun night out with our
Yeah.
friends. But over the years, and we are in our third year now, actually, it became community organizing,
Mm.
community service.
Yeah.
The Seattle open mic scene has exploded after the pandemic, and my duty as an organizer is to curate newly emerging voices and provide a platform for them.
Mm.
To find those voices, I regularly attend other open mics, and my goal is to kind of cross-pollinate the art scene across the town and also across the region.
Mm.
And we're in our third year now, and attendance and participation are kind of staying steady. They're not dropping off. So I think we're doing something right.
Yeah. Yeah.
The way I think about it, it's what I want it to be and what I want other people to get out of it, to feel that it's a safe, cozy space where, you know how they say, everybody knows your name.
Mm.
And when you do something with people year in and year out, you build
Mm.
connections with them.
Mm.
And Speak Out Seattle is my family now, and we are seeking to grow that family in the next year. And we have some ideas how to scale it up citywide so it becomes an even more inclusive community platform.
Fascinating. Dari, my last question for you. What message would you share with young writers who are trying to make sense of displacement or inherited trauma through art?
Hmm. Keep doing it. I know it's a difficult story to tell, and it's even more difficult to tell it skillfully and in a way that will resonate with people who may only have tangential understanding of your trauma. But if you feel that fire inside your belly to tell that story to others, your story,
Mm.
then it's a story worth telling.
Absolutely.
And nobody can tell your story better than you.
Absolutely.
As human beings, what distinguishes us from other species is that we're animals, but we're also a species of storytellers.
Correct.
Humans have passed down knowledge in the form of stories for
Yeah.
centuries.
Yeah.
And old stories definitely require being questioned,
Mm.
and new storylines need to emerge if we are to evolve as a humankind. And I think that young writers will be at the forefront of that next creative breakthrough.
Mm.
So my advice to them would be dive headlong into whatever scratches your artistic itch and
Mm.
find people with whom you can share your story. It's
Wow.
not always easy, but it's certainly worth it. And the
Absolutely.
world needs your voice.
Absolutely. The world needs your voice. And on that note, Dario, I just want to say thank you for such a fascinating conversation. I'm a published author of 10 books, but I've never been able to write poetry. And I'm always in awe of people who can put their thoughts across
Maybe you
in
just haven't
verse.
tried.
Maybe. But thank you for such an incredible conversation. Your passion came through so powerfully in every single question that I asked you. Thank you
Well,
again.
it is because your questions were really very good questions, and it made me think more deeply than I was just like, okay, yeah, I write poetry, and that's, so thank you for your questions.
Thank you again, and good luck to you.
Thank you so much to you as well.
Thank you for listening to the brand called You Videocast and Podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.